2 o'clock, so I'm gonna go ahead and give my little spill. Today, Mr. Ridge Howell will be presenting. He is a legal counsel for the Native Agricultural Financial Services. We're really glad that you guys have joined us today for this webinar over fractionated land and leasing. I think it's going to be a really interesting topic. I know that I've had some questions already to begin with on this webinar, and so I can't wait to see what kind of questions you guys are able to come up with when it comes to questions. Feel free to put any of your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box during the duration of the presentation. After the presentation is over, there will be a time for live Q&A. And so if you feel more comfortable not putting your questions in the chat, but asking them instead, feel free to do it that way too. The Native Agricultural Financial Service is a other lending institution focused on native agriculture. And we are really excited to be here. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ridge Howell, and he will be doing the presentation today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Let me make sure. Harley, is my presentation screen correct from the Zoom?
No.
Okay. How about now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. We will go ahead and get started. So today we're titling this just a practical overview for farmers and ranchers navigating fractionated lands for agricultural purposes. The overall goal is to give everybody an idea of how you can use tribal land, whether it's tribal trust land, restricted land, or fee land for collateral when applying for an agricultural loan, which can be kind of complicated because of the fractionated nature of Indian country. So, first up, I think it's helpful just to start with an overview of the different types of land ownership. We've got tribal trust land, which is a lot of what we think about whenever we think of Indian country. This is land that is within the boundaries of a reservation, and it's held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of current and future generations of tribal citizens. In order to put a structure on this land, it must be leased from the tribe. You also have allotted trust land because of the allotment policy, where allotments of trust land were given to individual citizens. A significant amount of trust land is held in trust for individuals. If an individual tribal member wants to use a parcel of allotted land to build a home, put up a business, or start an agriculture operation, the individual must obtain permission of all or some of those who have rights to the allotment. Since multiple generations have been born since the original allotment policy was carried out, one parcel of land, as we discuss later in the presentation, may have hundreds of people who have rights to the parcel. And while historically permission for a specific use of the land needed to be obtained from each person with an ownership interest in the parcel, recently a number of tribes have enacted policies to allow for percentages of signatures less than 100% of allotment co-owners. And we also have fee simple land. Fee simple land is the most common land ownership model in the United States and outside of reservation boundaries, and it refers to land that is not held in trust status. Much of the fee simple land within reservations was taken out of trust status, but now may be owned by a tribe, a tribal member, or a non-tribal member. So we have it in the title, and I know everybody's received some emails about it, but what is fractionation? It resulted from the federal Indian policy of allotment under the General Allotment Act of 1887, where tribal lands were divided up and allotted to individual tribal members. When the original Indian allotment owners passed away, though, their inherited equal undivided ownership interest in the allotment. So the land passes through each successive generation with the number of owners of undivided interest in the land growing exponentially. And we've got a slide over here that just kind of gives you a visual example of how land is passed down from the original allottee to further generations. So when the original Indian allotment owners passed away, their heirs inherited equal undivided ownership interest in the allotment. And as it continued to pass through generations, the number of owners of this interest in the land grew. And a fractional land interest is an undivided ownership share in a tract of land that is not physically identifiable from the property. So, for example, if you own a 16th fractional interest in an 80-acre tract of land, you don't own a specific 5-acre area within this tract. Instead, you own or you share an ownership interest in the entire tract with the other 15 co-owners. So although federal policy of allotment ended with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the fractionation process continues, resulting in the highly fractionated ownership of much Indian land today. Accordingly, many allotments now have dozens or even hundreds of individual co-owners that each share a portion of that ownership interest. Here's just another map that I think is helpful to get an idea of how fractionated, or sometimes referred to as checkerboarded, Indian country is. On the screen, there's a map of the Crow Reservation, and using the key in the top left corner of the picture, you can see all of the different types of land status that there are. So we've got tribal land that is owned by the tribe. You have allotted land, which is what we were just talking about. Special allotted land, Department of Interior, and tribal special allotted land, as well as fee land. So it gives you an idea of how, even in a fairly contained area, how many different types of land ownership interests can be present. Fractionation makes it difficult to use land for beneficial purposes, such as for agriculture, business, homes, or other uses that would improve the quality of life for Indian people. And it creates significant land management and administration challenges. At the same time, it is undermining tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Decisions on land use generally require majority consent of co-owners. So if we're using that 1/16th example that we talked about earlier, you'd have to have a majority of the 16 co-owners typically to agree on how to use the land for a specific purpose in order to use it. And it can be next to impossible to obtain that level of consent to lease or grant a right of way across highly fractionated land, which means a lot of Indian land remains idle and out of use. Even when required consent is obtained, economic benefit is often limited because income earned on fractionated land is divided among so many co-owners, with some owners' shares of income amounting to just pennies, while others might have a much larger portion of it. Fractionation impacts approximately 150 reservations across Indian country, with the majority occurring in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountain regions. And additionally, there are more than 100,000 fractionated tracts of trust or restricted Indian land. These tracts currently contain almost 2.5 million fractional interest, making up over 5.6 million acres. So why is fractionation historically and currently an issue for collateralizing your land for ag lending? We've mentioned some of them. There are historic issues with obtaining credit generally. Part of this comes down to the checkerboard nature of parcels, which can be really complicated to not only identify, but also decide how to use the land whenever you've got so many different types of ownership interest in it. There's a great lender unfamiliarity throughout the country whenever it comes to underwriting loans for tribal land, whether that's tribal trust land, restricted land, or individual allotments. And additionally, it's a complicated process that is specific only to tribal lands. So there aren't other groups or other minority groups around the country that have this specific issue of collateralization. So you could say there's maybe not always been a pressing need from the banking industry as a whole to really get good at collateralizing tribal land. And just some further description on why it's difficult. Tribal land cannot typically be collateralized because it's often held in trust by the federal government, which means it can't be sold or mortgaged without federal consent. This trust status, along with complexities like tribal sovereignty, make it difficult for lenders to seize and sell the land if a loan defaults, which puts them in a riskier position if default does occur. Because tribal lands are held in trust by the US government for the tribe, they cannot be sold or mortgaged like private lands. So we have, under federal law, a limited exception for collateralizing trust or restricted land through something called a leasehold interest. And a tribal leasehold interest is really just the temporary and exclusive right to possess, occupy, and use tribal trust or restricted land for a specific purpose and duration, which is both approved by the tribe and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In a typical real estate transaction, the borrower owns both the land in fee simple and any improvements on the land. However, on tribal trust land, legal title to the land is held by the federal government in trust for the individual members. The lessee, the individual or entity using the land, holds the leasehold interest, which is the right to use the land for a set period. Utilizing this leasehold interest allows for projects that require long-term investments without alienating the land itself. Continuing on the idea of the leasehold interest, there are two primary places under federal law that allow for a leasehold interest to be used as collateral for agriculture lending. The first place is under 25 USC, Section 415, with the corresponding regulations found at 25 CFR, Part 162, and then the Hearth Act of 2012, which we'll discuss both of those in the following slides. So first talking about 25 USC 415 and the corresponding regulations, there are four different types or four different purposes that a leasehold interest can be used. And those are for agricultural, residential, business, or wind and solar purposes. Part 162 establishes this rule for leasing Indian land for housing, economic development, and other purposes, and it outlines the conditions for approving leases, the requirements for different types of leases, such as an agricultural lease, and the procedures for administering and enforcing them. The regulations are designed to promote economic self-sufficiency of tribes and individual Indian landowners. These regulations detail the conditions and authorities under which the BIA will approve leases and administer them, and this includes requirements for lease terms, insurance, and land use. These regulations specifically consider agricultural leases under Subpart B, and they're intended, like I said earlier, to just promote tribal control and self-determination by allowing tribal laws and policies to be recognized and incorporated, and by deferring to tribal determination of the best interest when it's appropriate. The second way that we can collateralize tribal lands under federal law is through the Hearth Act of 2012. Tribal leasing tribal land without BIA review or approval is what's allowed through the Hearth Act. There are several requirements for a tribe to be able to use this for collateral or to establish a leasehold interest. Generally, they must have a tribal leasing code. The code must include NEPA processes or environmental review processes. The tribal code must be approved by the BIA and signed by the Secretary of Interior. And it applies to tribally owned trust land only. So individuals must still obtain regular BIA approval through the process described at 25 CFR 162. The Hearth Act essentially allows tribes to manage their own agricultural leases on trust and restricted land without, as I said, the BIA approval, provided that the tribe has their own regulations in place. This just streamlines leasing, the leasing process for a primary term of up to 25 years with two 25-year renewals possible. And this allows for tribes to set their own policies as long as they're consistent with federal regulations. This also applies to the leasehold interest on tribal trust or restricted land. Once approved, the tribe can lease its tribal trust and restricted lands for agricultural purposes without the BIA or the Secretary of Interior's specific lease approval. And I do want to take a second just to really hammer home that second point. The process that we're going to be describing further in these slides is generally referring to the leasing process at 25 USC 415, wherein somebody would obtain a tribal lease through approval from the BIA. And then after the lease was approved, they would then go back and get essentially the same application process to obtain a leasehold interest, which they could then use as collateral for agriculture lending. The difference with the Hearth Act is once a tribal code has been approved through the Hearth Act, the tribe then can manage, as long as they're consistent with their own regulations, they can manage and assign leasehold interest. So a tribe that is Hearth Act approved can basically skip out on the second step of BIA and secretarial approval whenever they are giving somebody the leasehold interest to secure a mortgage. Some basics whenever we're talking again about the regulations at 25 CFR Part 216. We start off in the same way as if we were just trying to secure a typical agriculture lease on tribal land. So we fill out an application package. If you were doing this, there are several parts that are required. First would be the lease document. There's no standard form provided under the regulations, but a typical lease document that the tribe would use. A land description from a public or private survey or an official legal description, a map of the parcel in question, bond / insurance, landowner consent whenever you're dealing with fractionated lands. So if you have a parcel that you're trying to obtain a leasehold interest in, you would still have to get consent from the other individual landowners on that parcel. You would have to have appraisal for purposes of ensuring fair annual rental value, environmental reports, like we talked about earlier through NEPA. And if the tenant is a legal entity, like a corporation or a partnership, they must also provide organizational, so the organizing documents for the actual entity's creation and your current financial documents. We talked about the lease document on the last slide and how there's not a specific form for it. However, there are pieces that must be included within the lease document in order to comply with the regulations. This includes the parcel in question, so the actual tract of land that you're trying to obtain a leasehold interest in, the purpose, so whether it's for an agricultural loan, a business loan, a residential loan, etc., the parties, so yourself and any other individuals with an interest in the land in question, the term of the lease or the mortgage that you're going after, a list of ownership or ownership improvements, so any improvements that have been made on the land with attached documentation corresponding to who those improvements came from, and payment terms. So going back to the legal description and the map, there aren't specific requirements that the regulations provide. They're more just like guiding steps. So the legal description must describe the lease premises by reference to a public or private survey. This could be through a legal description, a survey grade global position system description, so basically a mapping description, or another description prepared by a registered land surveyor that sufficiently identifies the leased premises. And additionally, best practice for this is using what they call a CFED-S, Certified Surveyor, which is an acronym for a Certified Federal Surveyor who has completed a voluntary certification program focused on performing boundary and land-related surveys on or near federal, tribal, and public trust lands. Um, Bonding, we mentioned this earlier. So not every type of lease under 25 CFR Part 162 requires bonding, but it is required for agricultural leases. This bond includes a payment of 1 year's rent, construction of any required improvements. So if there are issues on the land that have been noted as needing improvement to get it back to where it was at the time of the last uh, initiation of the last lease, those would have to be completed, and performance of any additional lease obligations, including payment of operation and maintenance charges. So if there are leftover charges from a previous lease, those would have to be paid up front as well. There is a waiver in two situations for the bond. It can be waived if it's provided under the BIA approved tribal code. So if whenever a tribe was submitting a code for agriculture leasing regulations, if they have provided for a bond waiver in that, the bond is waived. Or if the BIA, at the request of the owners of a majority interest in the agricultural lease, ask for it, the BIA can then also waive the bond requirement. How and when will BIA decide whether to approve an agricultural lease? So generally, there's not a strict form. There are a couple deadlines that BIA has to comply with, but those all come after you've submitted the original lease application. So BIA will receive the documents. They will review the lease and supporting documents. As part of their review, they will identify potential environmental impacts and ensure compliance with all applicable environmental laws, land use laws, and ordinances. And they will assure that adequate consideration has been given as appropriate to the following: the relationship between the use of the leased premises and the use of neighboring lands, the height, quality, and safety of any structures or other facilities to be constructed on the leased premises, availability of police and fire protection, utilities, and other essential community services, availability of judicial forums for all criminal and civil matters arising on the leased premises. So essentially an identification of where the choice of law or where any type of lawsuit will be heard for disputes under the lease, and an effect of the environment on the proposed land use. So this again goes back to that environmental NEPA review that's required as part of the leasing regulations. And it would just have to ensure that there aren't going to be any adverse uses or adverse effects on the land from initiation of the lease. So I said there wasn't a set form for exactly how BIA will respond whenever a lease is submitted, but there are a few deadlines that they do require or that they are required to comply with. So first, BIA will approve or deny the lease application within 30 days of receipt of the lease and supporting documents. If denied, the applicant will immediately be notified and advised of their right to appeal. And if BIA fails to meet deadlines for approvals of leases, assignments, and leasehold mortgages, then the applicant in question can appeal to the regional director, who has 15 days to act on the appeal. And then subsequently, they can also appeal to the Interior Board of Indian Appeals, the IBIA. So after the lease is approved, what happens? And just to go back, we earlier talked about the kind of difference between securing a leasehold mortgage interest through 25 CFR Part 162 and securing it through the Hearth Act. Um, Here's where the difference really comes into play, because under the regulations at 25 CFR, you will again have to apply for the lease and be approved by the BIA to operate that lease. And then, if you're interested in securing a leasehold mortgage or a leasehold interest on that property, which can then be used as collateral for an agricultural loan, there are some additional steps. So, the lessee interested in seeking a leasehold interest or mortgage for collateral purposes begins with preparing the leasehold mortgage package, which must include the following documents: the BIA lease number or a copy of the approved lease, the leasehold mortgage or deed of trust, a promissory note, any needed consent of landowners or notice to landowners. So if you're in a situation with fractionated land where you are having to acquire the consent of your co-owners of the parcel, that would have to be included in the mortgage package that you're preparing. And then again, that survey map with the legal description and or BIA parcel number or lot number. So a lot of this is basically duplicating almost exactly what you did when you were originally applying for the lease. We're just doing it a second time now to secure a leasehold interest that can then be used for collateral. Occasionally, additional documents are needed. This could include program writers for any loan programs that the borrower is participating in. So let's say you have a yearly FSA operating loan. That's something that would have to be documented and provided to BIA when you're trying to secure the leasehold interest. And satisfaction of any previous mortgage when applying for refinancing. So if this is a situation where you're trying to refinance something and you had a previous mortgage on it, you'd have to prove satisfaction of that mortgage. Um, Next steps after this, so we've applied for the lease, we've had the lease approved. Excuse me. After that, the BIA, or after you submit your mortgage package, the BIA will review it and respond in writing within 10 business days if there are any errors or missing documents. Excuse me. Um, During this preliminary review, the BIA will request an environmental review on the land to be mortgaged in accordance with NEPA. So sorry. This NEPA review may take the form of an environmental assessment, an environmental impact statement, or a designation that the land has a categorical exclusion. The BIA will review and respond to these mortgage packages in writing within 20 business days of receiving all required documents. And the BIA will review and respond to a right-of-way mortgage package in writing within 30 business days of receiving all required documents. So again, the difference in this is if you're applying for a leasehold interest through 25 CFR Part 162, you're going to first apply for the lease, excuse me, and then apply for the leasehold mortgage through that same process. Whereas if you are applying for a leasehold interest through the Hearth Act, you're basically skipping one step of this process because the tribe that the Hearth Act is approved through already has permission to grant leasehold interest mortgages on the land in question under their tribal code. So both ways are possible for using your tribally allotted, trust, or restricted lands for collateral when securing an agricultural loan. One of them is available to anybody or any tribal member seeking to do this through 25 CFR, and the other through the Hearth Act is available to tribes that have approved BIA tribal leasing codes. Excuse me. And then just two more kind of thoughts whenever you're considering how to collateralize or how to seek ag capital um, to use your land. Think diversify. In many ways, diversification is the best tool for mitigating risk. It's important to remember that just because of fractionation, or despite fractionation, many Indian landowners occupy more than one type of land. So, for example, my family lives still on our allotment in eastern Oklahoma, but we have expanded that some in the surrounding areas around the allotment. So we've got land that is held in trust by the federal government, but we also have fee land. So in some situations, it would make a lot of sense to try and use both of those lands or seek capital for use on both of those lands. With the fee land, it's obviously going to be a bit more simple. A typical lender or loan officer is going to have significant experience in collateralizing fee land. It's what they do every day across the country. But even if that's a possibility and you do have fee land that you can collateralize, there's no harm in seeking the same from restricted or tribal lands. And in fact, it's a good way to make sure that if something crazy does happen, you've got more than one source of income or income stream coming into the operation, which could, help balance out during really uncertain times, which a lot of farmers and ranchers are in right now. I like to think, do you occupy fee and restricted land? You do find ways that you can, again, diversify that. Could it be a beef cattle operation on one side and an agritourism venture on the other? It might be possible to gain some ag capital using both of these lines of credit. Um, Pull back and just see how the operation could work more efficiently or flow together. And then finally, there in the past couple of years, there have been several attempts to have rulemaking processes done on agriculture leasing. Most recently in 2023, the BIA put an effort together to overhaul specifically Subpart B agricultural leases to make them more consistent with the other subparts, which would provide more forms, which could be complicated, but I think in effect it gives people more surety in what they're submitting because they've got specific criteria listed out versus under the current regulations, there are suggestions to, you know, basically put your application in the best possible place for approval. But there aren't hardline criteria that really give you any type of assurance that you're going to be approved. There aren't any under consideration currently. So the agriculture leasing regulations that we have are at least consistent for this year and probably next. But it's possible at any time, especially in administration changes, that these will be revisited and another attempt will come to make these agricultural leasing portions of the CFR more consistent with the other pieces for business and residential purposes. And now I will exit out of the main presentation and open it up to questions.
I'm giving everybody the option to talk if they want to talk.
Awesome.
Hi, this is Mari Carsuza.
Hi. Is there any question that you have that I could answer or attempt to answer?
No, I don't have any questions right now. Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Hi, This is Laura from Z Form. Thank you so much for the presentation. Um, Out of curiosity, do you know how many of these applications for a leasehold interest are made every year? Or approximately? It feels like, not a lot of applications would even be
I
made just because of all the
um
trouble.
of course, I don't know a number off the, sorry, I'm still sharing my screen. I don't know a number off of the top of my head. I will take down your contact information and see if I can get one. I'm My guesstimation is that there aren't a ton. So this process, it's been available for a while. I mean, the Hearth Act process, at least going back to 2012, but it's complicated and there's not a central body that gives you a true walkthrough of how to do it. So, in my experience working in Indian country, a lot of tribal landowners are aware that it's possible to collateralize their tribal trust or restricted or allotted land, but nobody has a really clear idea of how to do it, which I think in turn means that a lot of times there's not many people applying for this. Um, I do know that in the, I'll see if I can pull it up. In the past 3 years, there have been a significant number of tribes that have applied for, um, not applied, submitted a tribal code through the Hearth Act for approval. And they've, like I said, a large number of them have been approved, and I do have that list. Um, Let me share my screen real quick. So you can see here, I guess not so many in
Mhm.
2025, but this list all the way back to 2013, which was the first year that the Hearth Act was in effect. And like I said, a significant number of tribes have applied. You'll see on this page that it's by subpart. So we've got agricultural, business, residential, and I can't think of the fourth now. But basically,
Wind and
they've
solar.
applied for wind and solar. Thank you. Tribal codes on these different ones. So I think the Hearth Act has probably become more popular because it does, in addition to tribes having more direct control over it, it also, part of the downside of using 25 CFR is that it is a basically twofold process. Uh,
Mhm.
Not exactly the same, but very similar in both steps. And the issue with that is, as most of you probably know, wait times when dealing with any bureaucracy, but historically BIA, can be pretty bad. And deadlines are not always followed. And I don't say that to necessarily place blame, but more so just kind of underscore that the process through 25 CFR can end up being really long and drawn out, which I think discourages a lot of people from doing it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
I have another one if nobody else has any. So, another question I had is you mentioned that some tribes um, allow for not necessarily 100% of the co-owners to have to have 100% of signatures. Do you know if that list is available somewhere of which tribes have enacted that?
It, I don't think there's a central list. The probably the quickest way to get to that answer would be on that page that we just looked at. Each one of those tribal code applications through the Hearth Act has the tribal code attached to it. And it's within the tribal code that the tribe would be able to decide whether or not they're going to allow for those type of signatories. I think typically it's a requirement that people on with a fractionated interest, so people on the lease would at least sign off on it. However, I've seen some examples, I think even maybe the Crow tribe, when I was preparing for this, had a exception in their tribal code for that. So it would really just depend on, and the exception was majority. They had to have a signature of the majority owner. So if, there were a few owners on it that could make up 51%, they would have to have 51% of the co-owners sign on to it in order for it to be approved. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And do you know if as that ownership changes, as there's, new generations coming up, and older generations dying out, like with each new member or old member being removed from the list, does the operation have to submit that change consistently? Or is
No.
this kind of a one and done process once you get all
They
the
would
signatures currently?
they would have to submit it for a new lease. So if there was new lease or an extension, if ownership changed, let's say you've got a 20-year or 25-year lease and you secured a leasehold interest in it, if ownership changed during that 25-year period, you wouldn't have to update BIA about that. However, on a new application or on an extension, you would note it in there that basically you wouldn't note specifically that the ownership has changed. You would just list all of the parties, which would reflect the ownership.
Got it. Thanks.
Of course. Thank you for the questions. I see Bryn has a hand up.
Yes. So I had a question. So in going through review for this, I know that there's some single agricultural individuals and farmers that are looking to um, get loans and things like of that nature. But my question is that through the process, you're saying that tribal code has to be adopted to reflect the CFR. And that being the case, if an individual wants to get a loan to be able to run an agricultural business on tribal lands, how lengthy is that process? And does that set precedents for many more individuals to acquire land, lease land? And how does that all work out? Because I feel that there's individuals in our neck of the woods that would like to be able to utilize some of those benefits. But I just know that because in my region, our secular leadership changes year to year. And so the review process for those things and for the tribe to be able to adopt a code, the chances of that happening for an individual to utilize those benefits to be able to get a loan to have an agricultural business just seems highly unlikely.
So just to make sure I understand your question, if you've got somebody on tribal lands that is wanting to open some type of agricultural operation and there's issues, there'd be a really big barrier in getting a tribal code approved because of the nature of elections and turnover. It'd be hard to get one approved through the Hearth Act or even through general ag leasing regulations because of that turnover. So how would somebody, if that wasn't possible, how would they get land that they maybe have a interest in the ownership of approved for business purposes. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's a couple prongs. It would first depend on what the actual operation was. If it was an agricultural operation, process would be basically what I've described up to this point. If it's a business operation, it would be similar to it, but there'd be some slight differences because those regulations are under subpart C, I believe. However, part of it is it really depends on what the status of the actual land is within the tribal area. So if it is tribal land that the tribe owns in fee status, which, like my tribe, for instance, we have a reservation, but we've also got pockets that are not included in the reservation that the tribe owns and operates businesses on. In that scenario, there wouldn't have to be any approval because the land isn't in trust or restricted status. So you could basically get a loan through typical methods using that fee land. If it's in trust or restricted status, so if it's tribal trust land that's held by the U.S. government, and you want to use your interest in it for collateral, the really only two ways for agriculture purposes would be, again, through the Hearth Act or through the general leasing regulations that are written out at 25 CF Part 162. That's a little rambly. Hank, do you have any specific, do you know what type of land it is that you're talking about or what the status of the land is?
Yeah, I believe it's all reservation land. It's not fee simple. It's not something that the tribe has recently acquired. It's part of the original, within the original reservation boundaries. And there's just
And
sub pockets where families happen to have fields, and they're just small agricultural fields. But there may be individuals that would like to, utilize more lands or secure loans to uh, acquire improvements to those said lands.
they would still be able to, through the, like I said, through the process described at 25 CFR, which they could do hypothetically even without the tribe having any tribal code. It would just be through the leasing regulations listed at the CFR. If you're talking about fractionated land, like let's say there was a 40-acre parcel that was a combination of fee land and tribal trust land, you could obviously use the fee land again for like a typical loan application process. But then the tribal trust land, if the tribe doesn't have anything in place via tribal code, you would have to go speak with the other undivided interest owners of the land. And they wouldn't necessarily have to do anything, but they would have to still consent to those improvements being made on the land. So you'd still have to get their sign off on it as part of the leasing application at 25 CFR. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
If you want these land questions in general are complicated. They're 10 times more complicated in Indian country. But if you've got, more specific questions and would like to connect over a Zoom sometime after this, I'd definitely be happy to take a swing at answering things more in depth.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. And I will put right now my email address in the chat box for anybody that would like to reach out for more in-depth conversation. Any other questions we could take?
Not that I can think of it for now, but thank you for answering and fielding those questions for me.
Of course, I'm happy to. Thanks for asking. We can't hear you, Harley.
I think you might be off the hook. Those were some really good questions, some really in-depth questions. I'm really glad. Ridge's email is in the chat. So if you guys have any questions that you think of afterwards, feel free to send him an email or you'll have my email. I will be sending out a link to the recording. It'll probably be tomorrow afternoon or maybe even Monday morning. So be watching for the video link in the email that I'll be sending. Trying to think if I have anything else. Just besides, thank you guys so much for joining us today and happy holidays. And I'll let you guys go and have the rest of your day.
Thank y'all.